Fake news. What is fake news? Something that has been part of our cultural awareness for a while now. And these days, it seems like down is up is down, left is right, inside and outside. We don't know what direction we're facing. And I think it relates really closely with our non-duality talks, how we relate to this concept or idea of non-duality, how we communicate non-duality. As I've said in other videos, non-duality isn't something that we know in the sense of what we typically consider knowledge to be. But I wanted to bring it up in this video and talk a little bit about fake news and how that relates to non-duality. So if you would journey down the rabbit hole with me to the very end, maybe you'll learn a thing or two or unlearn a thing or two as it relates to reality and perception and non-duality. Before we get into that, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and I appreciate all comments that you may have, any questions that you may have. So if you join me live today in this moment that doesn't exist, there's a little live chat that I can see your comments, and later on in this video I will go through some of those if you have any questions, so leave it there. If you're watching this video in the present moment at a different time, feel free to leave a comment. I enjoy seeing your comments, and it kind of gives me inspiration as to things I want to talk about that maybe you're interested in or struggling with as far as this whole idea of non-duality. So, welcome. I think the inspiration for this video, well, there's many inspirations, but I did see one speaker talking about non-duality and fake news in another video, and boy, I should have prepared for this to give him credit. It had something to do with fake news, non-duality, but I'm sure you can find it. Maybe I'll put it, if I find it, I'll put it in the notes of this video so you can see what he had to say. And it was an interesting take on non-duality, but as I watched it, it kind of gave me some ideas on what I would like to say in reference to truth, reality, what is a lie, what is real, what can you verify? Because with non-duality, it's not something that you can tangibly, empirically, scientifically determine or describe. So we often use pointers at what it is not. We look at duality and say, this is what we see, this is our perception. And in pointing out that duality, we can see, at least have a sense of what is behind it all, because you can't point to nothing. You can't point to non-duality because it doesn't exist in the sense that we think of it as existing. And I do want to start off with saying that even though we talk about non-duality not being a religion or a belief system, oftentimes what the mind does is create its own religion, create its own belief system based on the concept of non-duality, because as human beings, we communicate. There's a speaker and a listener. There is a connection between the two, and that's how we fumble our way through life. That's how we find a sense of communion. That's how we describe the experience that we have in this life and to be able to relate to one another. And so what the mind does is tries to grab onto something that cannot be grasped, cannot be solidified, cannot be held, and tries to make it something that it's not. And so oftentimes, I use a lot of intuition and some speculation and assumption as to what people are saying, and maybe it is my own hang-ups or my own opinions of what someone's saying, that maybe that's not what they're saying. Because a lot of times people make assumptions as to what you're trying to say, and that's not what you're trying to say because that's their perception of it. And so in this video about fake news, I think what really spoke to me was this idea that if you come to non-duality as meaning that they're hello esta Oscar Masi. Did I butcher that? St. George, Louisiana. So when it comes to that video of fake news, my takeaway from it was that you can take this idea that there is nothing, that we give life all the meaning it has, and that one idea becomes something the mind attaches to, and it says, this is the ultimate absolute truth, this belief system. And it's kind of like the idea of, saying that there is no absolute truth. That statement itself is a paradox, because that is making an absolute statement. And so we grasp onto this idea that there is no meaning, there is no truth in the 3D world, the world that we experience, the world that is tangible, the world of science, the world of matter, the world of what is not, or what seems to be the illusory world, the matrix, the Maya, whatever you want to call it. We look at that and say, well, there is no truth, because that's all an illusion, that's all a lie ultimately. And so what ends up happening is it becomes a self defense mechanism. It becomes something that we use to deny what is. It becomes another thing that the mind uses to deflect from direct experience into reality. Good morning, Daryl. And so when we use that in that way, oftentimes it's a way to be above it all, like be in this world but not of it. It's a way that we project our own ego into the world, in a sense that by saying that we don't have an ego, it's kind of denying an ego through the ego. And so when you talk about fake news and there is no truth, but I know that me personally, Russ, knows that there is no truth. We give life all the meaning it has, so ultimately life is meaningless. Then what that puts us in a position, in some respect, if we buy into that as a belief system, we hold that fast to be the reality, then what that can do is put us in a position that we know everything, and that we're kind of a know-it-all. And so from like an empirical stance of knowing facts, evidence, how we describe reality in a human way, we can basically say, well, we're above that because we know that there is no ultimate truth in the world. And so everything you say is a lie. Everything you say is a fabrication. because non-duality is the ultimate truth. And I know that, therefore, I can disregard everything you say as a basis in fact or a basis in the tangible world of experience. And so it's kind of like, and I'm not saying this gentleman in the video, that's really what he was getting at, but I'll explain it a little bit more as we go through here. But there is, from your own experience, if you make non-duality some sort of concept that you believe in, you struggle with the notion because you don't know what end is up. You start to hear other information, and it's like, well, why should I care about that? Or why does that matter? Or that's not really true because nothing is true. And you kind of fall down this nihilistic spiral into some sort of postmodern stance on life. And I think the ultimate truth of non-duality, what non-duality is really saying is that path is unnecessary. It's not saying that, okay, so all beliefs we create ourselves, all meaning we give to life is created. It's not saying that we have to negate everything and not have any beliefs, not have any ideas of what truth is in the sense of, in the normal sense of how we defined knowledge in this world. So you don't have to go down and say, you don't have to burn down the whole world of knowledge to say that none of it has any meaning and it's all a bunch of crap. And I'm above it all and there's no way to know anything. So therefore I decide to know nothing. And I think as a religion, that puts you in a position of powerlessness, because the ultimate power is realizing that your stance that life is meaningless is also just another belief system. And people can use knowledge of how the world works, how energy flows, how people develop, how they interact. That can be used as a way to disempower the everyday person or yourself specifically. And so by saying that there's no way to know truth, there's no way to know facts, everything is fake news, then there's no way to have any power because you can't know that. And so you give up, you throw in the towel and say, well, there's no point of becoming a philosopher or a scientist or a journalist or anyone or a lawyer that wants to determine the facts of the matter or the truth, because everything is an opinion, it's all your perception. And so you go down in the spiral of postmodernism and realize and determine that it's all a bunch of crap and there's no reason to worry about anything. And at the end of the day, there's truth to that as well, but it all comes down to holding on to something hard and fast as the truth, and it becomes another thing that your separate self or ego dictates in your life. I guess I will read your comments as we go here, so I appreciate it. Ista says, in regard to absolute truth, people often say Jesus is the only way, but they overlook the fact that there may be many ways to Jesus. No one person has copyright privileges of Jesus or Buddha or Krishna, etc. Hello, Mallory. Yes. Yes. It's like in the third Matrix when Neo is in limbo or Mobile Avenue in the subway station, and he talks to Sati's dad, which I can't think of his name offhand, but he says, talking about his daughter and, you know, how he loves her so much that he would do anything to keep that connection. And Neo says, you know, or he looks confused and he says, you know, you speak of love, but you're, you know, a program. How can programs love? And the guy at the subway says, you know, love is a word. And it's kind of like the same thing as Jesus and God, and we can interpret the Bible or any sort of religious text in a certain way, and it becomes a matter of semantics in a lot of sense, which is good to discuss and communicate. But I think the idea of absolute truth and what it means to be in communion with Jesus or the Godhead or Buddha or whatever you want to call whatever your belief system is, it's more than just words. So another inspiration for this video was that's a little tribute there. Another inspiration for this video was an article from the purveyor of ultimate truth, the New York Times. It's called "Don't Go Down the Rabbit Hole." It's an opinion piece, so it is opinion. It's not one of their hard hitting journalism pieces that they do. "Don't Go Down the Rabbit Hole" by Charlie Warzel. And he said, and the subtitle is "Critical Thinking, as we're taught to do it, isn't helping in the fight against misinformation." So don't go down the rabbit hole is his opinion. So there's misinformation, disinformation. You know, I think if you're not aware of the difference, obviously, if you look at the pretext of the word, misinformation is something that is false that you put out there into the stratosphere that is not true and can lead people in the wrong direction, but there's no intentionality of it. Disinformation is purposeful. It's putting out false information in order to deceive, essentially. And I like this article because it talks about the title itself caught me. Don't go down the rabbit hole. So he's saying beware of the rabbit hole. So you can check out that article. I've got it linked in the down below here in this video. And so he talks to this in this opinion piece. He talks to this academic named Michael Caulfield, and what he says is, stop overthinking what you see online. On its face, it says, don't overthink things, which is great. You know, for myself, being a type 5 on the Enneagram, I tend to think a lot, which is, you know, sacrilegious to other non-dual speakers, because apparently you're supposed to not think anymore. It's just there is no thoughts because there's no person. And so he's a digital literacy expert at Washington State University, Vancouver, up in Canada. Wait, is that in Canada? I don't know. Maybe it's in Washington. Oh, Washington State. I guess the name of it's Vancouver. So misinformation rides the greased algorithmic rails of powerful social media platforms and travels at velocities and in volumes that make it nearly impossible to stop. That alone makes information warfare an unfair fight for the average internet user. But Mr. Caulfield argues that the deck is stacked even further against us, that the way we're taught from a young age to evaluate and think critically about information is fundamentally flawed and out of step with the chaos of the current internet. So if you're into this discussion of non-duality, and I'm assuming so if you've made it this far in the video, and by the way, if you stick around, I'll actually give you some practical tips that I'm going to point you to. That's not my idea, but it's something that I've mentioned before, I think is worth looking into. there's my hook to watch, make you watch this video to the end. But so back to the article, we're taught that in order to protect ourselves from bad information, we need to deeply engage with the stuff that washes up in front of us. Mr. Caulfield told me recently. He suggested that the dominant model of media literacy, if kids get taught any at all, is that you'll get imperfect information and then use reasoning to fix that somehow. But in reality, that strategy can completely backfire. In other words, resist the lure of rabbit holes, in part by reimagining media literacy for the internet hellscape we occupy. So he's saying we occupy a world, a hellscape of the internet that has so much information that we don't know how to process it. We process it incorrectly. We believe things that aren't true. And I'm sure there's a lot of truth to that. But so the solution of fake news and not being directed in the wrong fashion based on information that you're not sure if it's true or not is to not critically think. And I like that in the sense that it's the opposite of what you would expect. You know, duality is a lot about polarity. So it is interesting to read this article from that perspective of, you know, everyone would assume on its face that you want to be a critical thinker when it comes to consuming media, consuming news, information. So why would you say that? And it's interesting that you would say that in the first place. So the goal of disinformation is to capture attention, and critical thinking is deep attention. So deep focus, deep attention, sitting with an idea, a concept, a piece of information, and trying to figure out whether or not it's true. And that's the goal of disinformation, is what he says, to capture your attention. So you talk about viral videos or kind of agenda setting or gaslighting. It's like they want to grab your attention so you can pay attention to it. They can get more eyeballs on the disinformation. People learn to think critically by focusing on something and contemplating it deeply, to follow the information's logic and the inconsistencies. So it's saying, don't meditate on something, don't look deeper, don't look at other sources. Well, I don't know if they necessarily say that, but don't try to understand a topic deeply. Try to stay superficial. The natural human mindset is a liability and an attention economy. It allows grifters, conspiracy theorists, trolls, and savvy attention hijackers to take advantage of us and steal our focus. All right, so here's the meat and the potatoes of it. So they came up with this system to combat the dynamic of disinformation and teach media literacy. And what Mr. Caulfield met Mr. Weinberg, and they suggested a model called SIFT. So SIFT is, number one, it's an acronym. Number one is stop for the S. SIFT. I is investigate the source. 3 is find better coverage. And 4 is trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. SIFT is stop, investigate, find, and trace. So let's skip through here. The 4 steps are based on the premise that you often make a better decision with less information than you do with more. Also, spending 15 minutes to determine a single fact in order to decipher a tweet or a piece of news as coming from a source you'd never seen before will often leave you more confused than you were before. The question we want students asking is this a good source for this purpose? Or could I find something better relatively quickly? Because we can't take any time to determine truth. We have to make a quick judgment, because the more we look, according to this article, the more we get confused. I've seen in the classroom where a student finds a great answer in 3 minutes, but then keeps going and ends up won over by bad information. So that's the kind of the crux. There's more in this article from the New York Times, but that's kind of the main idea. of their suggestion as to stay on the surface of everything. Don't look deeper. Don't question anything. Just investigate the source is number 2 on the list in the SIFT model. And what I would say to that is, it's an interesting take, but what ends up happening is when you stay on the surface of things, then you look at a headline or you read the first, you skim through the first paragraph, and it's easy to write headlines that are misleading or to have the actual information be at the end of the article, or to basically rely on appeals to things that are not necessarily true in the logical sense. And so I did want to share this book, and I know this, you're like, what does this have to do with non-duality? Well, nothing and everything. But this book is called A Rule Book for Arguments, the second edition by Anthony Weston. And it's not very thick, and I don't know if you can find this online anymore. I read this in college. And I think if you want to look at fake news or disinformation, I think one of the big starts is to look at what the message actually is and how that's being portrayed, as well as looking at the source of the information. But if looking at the source is the main thrust of your opinion as to whether it's true or not, then you're setting yourself up for believing something that may or may not be true. And the idea, the metaphorical story that we all are probably aware of is the emperor that has no clothes. And the whole town, there's a parade, and the whole town saw the king come through the parade completely naked because he was duped by his tailor to make a suit that was the most beautiful thing in the world, but he was just butt naked. And everyone, because they didn't want to seem weird or be a conspiracy theorist, said, oh, what a beautiful outfit, it's so great, until the kid came up and said, hey dude, you're naked. And just because everyone agreed that the emperor had a nice set of clothes on, a beautiful apparel, didn't make it true. And there was another quote, I think it came from Abraham Lincoln, if I get this right. But the idea is, so how many legs does a dog have if you consider the tail its legs? So if you add the tail into the number of legs, how many legs does the dog have? Well, obviously the answer you think would be 5, but I could be butchering this quote, but I think what Lincoln said was, no, there's not 5 tails. Just because you believe and call the tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. That's 4 legs. So in the rule book for arguments, you talk about fallacies and logical inconsistencies. And before I mention that quick, I just wanted to say to that respect is that, when you talk about arguments, if you're not into this kind of discussion, most people, the connotation of an argument is a fight or a heated discussion on a topic or a belief that you have with someone else. And so it has a negative connotation to being something you want to avoid because it's a way to express your anger. But an argument is basically, forming a logical claim or hypothesis, oftentimes backed up with evidence. And so who can argue better is who can actually make more sense, common sense, who can make a logical statement that seems to be true. And so if you look at how arguments are formed, you can use better discernment into what someone is trying to say, because you can see the argument that they're trying to make, whether it's clear or not. You can kind of see through the statement, the wording, and to see what their intention is to make you want to believe. And oftentimes the reason why I think this article is funny is because it comes from, New York Times, and a lot of these media companies that have been seen to be maybe not 100% truthful, and that's being nice, are coming back to say, hey, believe us, consider the source. So investigate the source. And so on its face, they want you to appeal to the idea of authority, and the authority being the media, the mainstream, is the ultimate purveyor of truth when it comes to fact-based reality or understanding of the world. And so if you just quickly say, well, what's the where did this come from? Well, it came from the New York Times. It has to be true. Back 20, 30 years ago, before the internet, mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, the news sources, there was less opportunity to get information. And so there was always this assumption, whether or not journalism has changed, that's another conversation. But you go to write a paper or something for school, and you would go get the microfiche. You want to look back at an old article, and you'd basically say, oh, this is true. And then internet came out. It's like, well, you can use one internet source, but maybe it's not true or whatever. But the internet's so much bigger than what it was at the beginning, because you can see video, you can see original sources. So I do like the trace claims and stuff, because ultimately you have to make up your own damn mind. And so you look at the original context, and if you can point in that direction and understand what the original statements are versus the cover of the interpretation of it, then you can have a better, clear understanding of what's true or what's not true, what's fake. And so the internet has done a really good job of allowing people to put out information that contradicts maybe certain narratives, puts out information that you can understand how you're being deceived. And so if you're a mainstream news source that has had control over the agenda of information flow to the masses, you don't really like a challenge to that authority. And oftentimes people look at the media and say, well, the reason why they're failing is because people don't like newspapers, because they don't want to get their hands dirty with the ink. And then I think that's a cop-out. I think that is just a new sources of information, alternative media is becoming more dominant, not because it's all online or it's digital. It's because there's more of a focus on citing sources and providing original context and stuff like that. That maybe in clear, no, I shouldn't say clear. So ultimately, when it comes to any sort of media, any sort of message or source, and I think by saying find better coverage, the F in SIFT, there's this underlying assumption that they're the good source. So this is coming from the New York Times saying, don't look at anything else. Don't go down the rabbit hole. Only look at what we have to say, because we offer truth. And anytime you look at people that say, only believe me, that's when you start questioning things. And if you look at, we're in the age of censorship, social media companies and everything else, there's a reason why there's information that they don't want you to see. And so I'm going to read some of your comments here before we move on. Mallory says, pointing to a rabbit hole that one should not go down creates a Streisand effect, making others curious of what's down the rabbit hole. It has the opposite effect. Exactly. And so the more, I think the struggle, the cat's out of the bag, in my opinion. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. People have understood the power of open source information, of the internet, of sharing ideas and concepts. And so there's no way to go back. There's no way to stop what's already here, because people have seen the power that provides. And so, oftentimes you look at social media companies, and it's just that whole concept of social media. It's like, well, we didn't have that 20 years ago. We didn't have social media. And so, the social media companies can do whatever we want because yeah, sure, they can censor and stuff, but it's their platform and we're just on their platform, and so they should be able to do whatever they want. And I think the funny thing is the power that is like the power that social media and the internet can take away from the individual person if we give it away. So if we post our entire life, we have no privacy, we post where we're at all times, our opinions, our beliefs, our information, we give it all away. There's so much power, and if we give this new form of communication, if we allow them to dictate what we know, what we see, how we can communicate, then we're giving up all of our power to these companies. And in return, they're telling us how to look at the world, how to perceive reality. Back 20, 30 years ago, the New York Times wasn't able to get in front of us on an everyday basis. And when I say New York Times, not them specifically, but a certain collective narrative wasn't able to have such, when people stare at their phones all day long. Yeah, so you read a newspaper once a day, let's say, that's one thing, but the repetition of messaging, the power of that is so huge. To say that, well, we give you the opportunity to have social media, therefore don't worry about what we do, I think that's really disingenuous, because if we're not aware of the power of the platform, of the medium as the message, we don't understand the power that is potentially there, then it's going to be a one-sided deal where we get the raw end. Ista says, perhaps we're born inside a rabbit hole already and we need to climb out instead. But who gets to define what is or isn't conspiracy theories? Are the academics the only ones that get to define what constitutes conspiracy theories? So, who came up with who pushed the narrative of this idea of a conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist? Was it the CIA? Who knows? But the idea, how it's used, you can see it used as a weapon. So anyone that doesn't fall in line with the official story or the narrative that wants to be pushed by the mainstream, the easy way is to call it a conspiracy theory. And it's a derogatory way, a negative connotation to basically discredit anyone. So you're discrediting what the person says without actually looking at the information, or you look specifically at the source and say, well, this person has no credibility, or they said this one thing once, or they had a beer one time and they took a picture of themselves, so they're discredited. And so in the YouTube video that I mentioned earlier on, the gentleman talked about conspiracy theory, and the impression that I got was, anything that didn't subscribe to his belief system or the mainstream or what was acceptable was considered a conspiracy theory. He said something to the effect of, there were because I think he's a pastor. There were people in churches that he heard that half of the people talked about conspiracy theories of election fraud, or of any sort of theories about Antifa or whatever political stance you want to take, or and like, wow, there's so many people that are just deceived in conspiracy theories. And it's like, okay, well, what is the appeal when you talk about conspiracy theories? It's an appeal to authority, like I mentioned, or it's an appeal to consensus, as in regards to like the emperor has no clothes. And so it takes someone with a lot of strength and courage to stand up against the majority or the perceived majority to say, hey, this isn't true, or we need to look at this because there's a question here. And so when just by saying the hot button issues, if you talk about election fraud, now you can't talk about it or they'll kick you off social media. Maybe YouTube will want to kick me off now, but like, why is that? And so if someone questions the official narrative or says, hey, there's alternative information here, not alternative facts in the sense that I just make stuff up. because I think when it comes down to saying that we give life all the meaning it has, it's like, well, that's your truth, that's my truth. Well, my truth is yes, but how can you verify? How are facts and information verifiable? That's what you got to look at when it comes to verifying information, whether it's true or not. And that all falls apart when you talk about non-duality, which I'll get to. But when you look at truth in the sense that we can understand it as human beings, you have to be able to verify that information, and to ask for that, to demand that, doesn't make it something that it's a bad thing, or that you should avoid or should be censored about. And so if you say, well, everything that I don't believe is a conspiracy theory because I know that everything is a lie, or I know that life is an illusion, then you're not doing the work to verify that. You're just basically taking this stance. You're believing something based on no verifiable information, and it's a lazy way that the ego or the mind takes. And I'm not saying this gentleman is doing that, but it's an easy way for the ego to push off information and take a stance based on no reality that's actual. Who decides what the sources are official? Exactly. Who does decide? Mallory says, if info is misinformed, then why even acknowledge it? Why spend so much time and effort trying to officially discount it? Let me read that again. If info is misinformed, then why even acknowledge it? Why spend so much time and effort trying to officially discount it? Yes, I see what you're saying there. So if you want to discredit misinformation or disinformation, what would be the best technique? Would it be to censor it or ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist or attack the person that's questioning, or say that the source is not? So if you have a source that's providing a video, or let's say a court case or a study, and they're linking to it and they're commentating on it, could you question the commentary and say, well, maybe they're interpreting this incorrectly? Sure. Could you look at the original source, the text that they're referencing, and question that? Sure. But by pointing to it and informing people on that information, if you don't allow that, then you're basically not giving people enough tools to make an informed decision. And why are you doing that? What's the threat behind that? If you want to discover truth, you have to allow that to come to the surface. You have to allow people to see things and make a decision for themselves. Otherwise, it's just a power play. And that's essentially what this idea of truth and reality and lies versus fiction. Yeah. Lies versus truth. It's a power play. And so if you want to maintain power, you point the finger at the opposition and say, hey, they are fake news, without any real tangible evidence or arguments backing up that statement. And so that's where the term fake news is thrown around in a lot of sense, especially by the New York Times in this article, to say everything else is a conspiracy theory. We have the power to tell you what is real, and do not look at the man behind the curtain. Let's see. Ista says, Mallory, so true. When I notice people going out of their way to debunk conspiracy theories, they belie the fact they are afraid of the information. Like you said, they end up drawing more attention to the topic, and they were trying to detour people away from, let's see. Oh, let's go. I was originally raised in Christianity. One of the biggest conspiracies, in my opinion, is banning books, i.e. the Gospels of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, Philip, etc. Yeah, exactly. And so, if you look through history, who are the people that wanted to ban books or burn books or censor people? Was it the good guys or the bad guys? Well, there is no good and bad. It's all relative, whatever. Okay. Well, that's like I said, that's another belief system to say that there is no good or bad, there is no right or wrong. That's just another belief. And how does that color your life? How does it affect your viewpoint on life. And because yet again, it's just another way of perception. And so when you look at this idea that, you can't have this information because it could mislead you, you're limiting people's opportunity to have an informed decision being made. And I would argue, if you look at history, the people that don't want you to look at stuff are the people that don't have your best interest. I don't think that's a stretch to say, but it's an argument, it's a claim. I'm not going to back it up with any historical references right now due to time, but you should just believe me because I'm trustworthy and I have a YouTube channel. And I'm a non-dual master, so you should trust what I have to say. All right, so I say so a lot in these videos, I do know that. So how does this all relate to non-duality? So in fake news and understanding the world at large, we want to verify the information that's coming to us, and it can be difficult, and time is a factor. We can't know everything, but that's part of the stance of the separate self, is wanting to know everything. And in reaction to the knowledge that you can't know everything, because I did get a text or a comment. Let me read this quick from someone that looked at my previous video. Let me pull it up here. Science confirms Advaita in Newton's third law. And I asked how so, and this is from Gordon Green. The force always appears in two. Taken together, they annihilate each other. As there is no force, there is no motion. Even in delusion, clues are found. I think that is definitely spot on in the sense that there is always a connection. There isn't a completely autonomous, separate entity. It's all in communication, in relation to one another in that sense. And so when it comes to there it is. So when it comes to fake news, there's always a messenger and a receiver of the message. And so it's always a two-way communication, even if it's a one-way medium where, right now we have comments, we can kind of go back and forth, but even if I wasn't reading comments, I was just talking to the camera and you were receiving what I'm saying on the other end, there's still a two-way connection there in that relationship of the message. And oftentimes what that can lead to is this idea of perception is reality. So there is no objective reality outside of my perception. And I think that is the ultimate ego trip, to say that it's my truth. What I believe to be real is the only reality because that is the world as I see it. And that essentially is a cop-out into doing any real work on understanding how the world is. But from the idea of non-duality and what is, there's no way to be able to perceive it. Because once we try to grab onto it as something that we learn or a perception, then it becomes not that. Because non-duality, as you probably heard, it means not to. So when we try to make it something, it loses all meaning. And so how do you try to understand non-duality using logic and reason? Well, ultimately you can't. And so that's where this idea of perception being reality is true in a sense, but in another sense, there is an objective reality outside of your perceptions, because it's not all about you and your perception. It's not about all of us and our perception collectively. There is an objective reality. There is what is. But we have to understand, when we're looking at information of the world, there is a perceptive nature to it. And we have to understand there is no separate duality of a relationship to meaning. There is always that connection. And so we have to recognize the perceptions that we have that color how we relate to this world, how we relate to truth. And if you disregard that connection, if you disregard the fact that you are projecting your inner reality to the outer world, then you can believe things that are a bunch of BS. And so it becomes, like I said, a self-deceptive, or a what's the word? Self-defensive mechanism, phrase, that we use to basically deny looking at the beliefs that we have, deny attaching ourselves to beliefs and pretending that those attachments aren't there. And so what does that mean in reality is coming to terms with the fact that you do have beliefs, that you do have ideas about the world, you have concepts, you have language, you have perceptions, and understanding that that is present. If you come into non-duality and believe that, if you see non-duality as a religion, then you're not being honest with where you are as far as your perceptions. It becomes a way to not look into your habitual thinking, not look into the lies that you tell yourself, and understanding that the external world and the inner world are ultimately connected. And what I mean by that is, if you want to verify truth, there's different ways to approach it, but one would be to look at the observable world, look at information, and analyze, verify what is true or what is not true. And the message of non-duality is to understand that the binds, the strings that are attach you to those ideas, those beliefs, aren't really there. It's something that we choose. We give life the meaning that it has. And so, is the sky blue? I'm looking out the window. The sky is blue. Can I declare that as truth? Well, it's all collective. It's all, we just determine that it's blue. Okay, well, what does that mean? We all look up at the sky, we see a similar color, and we call it blue. Okay, well, that is true because we all say it is. We all agree to the idea that it's blue. Okay, well, let's look at it scientifically. Objectively, it's because of the light rays coming through the atmosphere at a certain frequency, and that's why we perceive it as blue. And we can verify that by looking at other colors and agreeing that, hey, this color, oh no, here, this color blue is similar in the same spectrum of the color of the sky, and so therefore those things match. We can all agree that it's blue, and we can look at anything with that particular frequency is determined blue. But then you look at meaning of words. Why do we call the sky blue? Why do we take a certain spectrum of visible light and declare that to be blue? Why don't we take purples and greens and lump it into some category and call it something else? Why do we use the word blue? And so you can go down this path, and that's the rabbit hole that they want you to avoid. But then you look at it and you say, okay, well, we have the sky being blue. Is it true? Is the law of gravity true? Is it tested? Is it studied? Is it understood to be ultimately true? Well, if you pretend gravity doesn't exist, that doesn't mean you can, jump out of a balcony and not break your legs if it's high enough off the ground, or getting severely injured, because it's a law of gravity. And by pretending that it doesn't exist is probably not something I'd recommend. But that's where people can go down that path of like, well, if everything is relative, I don't know what's true. I'm just so confused. Like nothing's true. There is no reality. There is no person. I'm just, and you get in this tailspin, and then you end up believing things that are not verifiable. And so I assure you the law of gravity exists. But the question you want to ask yourself is, what is my attachment to that belief? And the non-duality is that emptiness, that empty fullness, that freedom behind it all, to understand that it is a belief. Even if it is a law of gravity, it's something that it's a concept that I believe in. It may be practical or pragmatic to believe in it. And I would put more stake in gravity than I would in a New York Times article. Does that make sense? So when I read things, when I consume media personally, I look at it, and obviously I like information. So that's, some people don't like information or wanting to know anything. But when you look at this, things that you consume on a daily basis, if you're present with it and you look at it and you say, to what extent am I going to take this to the bank? Am I going to say this is true? And you can consume it on various levels of connection, of attachment to reality. And the more things are verified, the more you can be consistent in knowing that it's most likely true. And so you don't have to be a believer of non-duality and sit on the fence all day. You can have passions, you can have belief systems, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I think ultimately there's always this sense that, maybe it is a bunch of crap and I should question it. But whether or not you question it doesn't really matter. But if you believe things to be empirically untrue, that can have a significant or an effect on your experience in this 3D motion world. So when you talk about Newton's third law of motion, it's a law of motion. You can take that and apply that to Advaita or non-duality, and you can make that as something that you understand your connection to the world. And that idea is something that you can connect to and believe to be real in most senses. And it doesn't mean that you are a bad person because you believe in gravity or Newton's third law of motion, where equal and opposite reaction. As Shakespeare, Ista says, as Shakespeare said, who is a heretic? Is it him who burns or him who lights the funeral pyre? Valerie says, I feel this is why we call it the awakening. It seems like an organic movement as a result of information being so accessible. The collective is questioning now more than ever. It's exciting to me. Yes, I would agree. I think, even the term awakening is used in different ways. So you have to look at, what are the meanings behind that term. And when people come to non-duality, that's kind of the ultimate goal, is to be awakened, to be enlightened, to find the peace that non-duality promises, that you can just kind of coast through life and nothing affects you, or you just deal with that, the reactions of life, and everything is great. And you're looking at it from a sense that you want to have a certain reality of what is, versus looking at reality as what is. So if you have a reaction to life, if life comes at you in a certain way, instead of trying to avoid it by saying, well, I'm a non-dual master. You accept what is, and you give your will to God, essentially. I think that is part of the message of non-duality, of realizing that you aren't the one that is ultimately doing anything. You are powerless as a separate individual, but you are very powerful, especially when you connect to the will of God. From a non-dual perspective, even those that try to afflict us are benefiting us in some way by teaching us something about ourselves. Yes. Yes. So I think there is an awakening in the sense that people are starting to see, getting information that goes against things that are not true, or that you can hold up this information and this and say, well, this is more true than this. And so it gives people the tools, the power to make more informed decisions and to see how they are being manipulated on a daily basis. You can see through the fake arguments, the fake appeals to authority and consensus, and be awakened. And then there's this idea of wokeness, or so you've got like the awakening of non-duality is to a not awakened, where nothing bothers you apparently. And then there's the awakened through the information warfare, through the freedom of information, the dissemination of facts and other evidence that isn't just through the consolidated power structures that we have in society. And then there's this kind of moralistic wokeness of looking at those that are disenfranchised and saying that I'm aware of this. I understand that these people are suffering, and I am somehow awake to how we're being manipulated. But through all those processes, there is the opportunity to become deceived yet again. And that's the goal of the mind, not the goal, but that's the mechanism of the mind. It can be a source of release, and it can be a source of attachment. It can be a source of being deceived yet again. And so if you're trying to understand, if you're trying to find freedom through the mind, ultimately you'll fail. That's the paradox. Is you can find alternative information. You can realize, like when I talked about the Enneagram and realizing that I'm acting like a character, that can be a way to free through information, through learning, in the sense that we understand knowledge in this world. It can be something that we can use to open ourselves to other possibilities, to free our mind, to see the world from a different perspective. But it can also be a way to yet again deceive. Mallory says, yes, I'm not able to throw away all meaning or completely disidentify. And I think what I would say to that, Mallory, is why do you want to completely disidentify? What's the motivation there? So ask yourself that, or not. All right, so yet again, I think if you want to watch this video again and maybe play a drinking game every time I say the word "so," you're probably pretty intoxicated at this point. But don't do that, because I don't endorse that. But it would be funny. I did want to say, oh yes, the information. So if you've journeyed this far, we're over an hour into. Oh, okay, hold on. Mallory says I don't want to anymore. I'm over. Laugh out loud. Okay, so yeah, you learned something. You learned nothing. You learned that you didn't have to do anything. Isn't that great? So, oh man, I give up. up. No, I'm just kidding. I did give up on the idea that I had to be a perfect speaker, and that's a good thing. Yes, you wanted to make it this far in this video to give some practical advice as to what you should do in regards to believing stuff that may or may not be true. And when it comes to non-duality, isn't something that you have to do, because you don't have to do anything. But the reason why you want to understand non-duality is because you're looking for something else. You're looking for the answer to the question, what is the matrix? So I'll give you something. It may be helpful or not. Like I said, it's of no consequence to the reality of non-duality. And I've mentioned this in other videos, but I think a really good system that I don't really use on a consistent basis, but I've looked into it at certain points, and I found it to be helpful. Ista says, every time you say, so send me $1, by the end of the video, I can have enough to retire. Very funny. How do you question your beliefs? How do you question your perceptions of the outer world? Because those two are connected, like I said. Byron Katie, perhaps you've heard of Byron Katie. She talks about the 4 questions, and I would direct you to her work. And let me pull it up just so I don't butcher where to send you here. And maybe I'll put a link in the description as well. Oh, it's called The Work, or I think it's also called 4 Questions. So if you go to thework.com, essentially, how do you do the practice? It's kind of like a meditation, but I think it really connects with the concept of non-duality, because it's all about looking at opposites and questioning how you see the world. And one of the main things that she recommends is to write it down. And I think it's good advice to write things down, because if you don't have it tangibly, if you don't lock it in, the mind is really, it's a good magician. It can take that and twist it in a different way, or it can form it in a different way. But once you make it tangible, something you can look at, then you can really question it. You don't necessarily have to write it down, but there's a power in words. And that was something I wanted to talk about in this video, but we're already past an hour here. But if you look at the idea of magic, it's the power of words, and how do you use those words to either have power over people, or to use it in a sense to empower yourself. Because everything we say, we give it meaning, we give it power. But that's a conversation for another day. So the 4 questions of the work of that Byron Katie discusses is, the first question is it true? The second question is, can you absolutely know that it's true? And this is the sticking point of those that are familiar with non-duality. The frustrating part of the second question is, can you absolutely be sure that it's true? And if you're into non-duality and everything is illusion, that question is always no. I cannot be absolutely sure that the sky is blue. I cannot absolutely be sure that there is gravity. And so you kind of feel shortchanged in that question, because you skip through the first question. Is it true? Well, maybe, maybe not. You know, you can agree to say that, yeah, maybe it's true. But then you get to that second question and you say, can you absolutely know that it's true or not? And what I would say to that is not necessarily looking at the content of what you're trying to determine truth, the statement that you make that you believe in. Look at how it ties in with the other. You got your thinking center, your feeling center, your instinctual center. How are those tied together? Because non-duality in its pure sense conceptually is completely, it's like a floating head. It's not connected to any sort of real physical, emotional sense of truth. And so, can you absolutely be sure? Take some time and really sit with that one, because then you'll maybe see those attachments that you have. The third question is, how do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? And so this is kind of the next step of what I'm saying here is look at your reaction to that thought. Why is that something that you're bringing up as an issue? Why is it something that you are believing in its current form? And then the fourth question is, who would you be without that thought? And as someone that looks into non-duality, who would you be without that thought? Well, I am no person, so I would be no one. So like, you can take the four questions and either not do the work or do the work. And if you're going at it and it gives you a sense of you not doing the work, then that's maybe something you should question, because then most likely there's a belief there that you have non-duality giving you a reason to avoid doing the work. And so that's something that I would look into, maybe spend some time with that. And so I'm going to wrap it up here in a minute. Ista says, every time you say, oh, I already read that. Okay, Mallory says, yes, love her, really cuts out the BS. Will help you mature immediately in the moment. So I censored Mallory. I didn't use the swear word. Will help you mature immediately in the moment. Yes, I think there's a lot of value to that. I think it's pretty clear. It's an easy way to not let the mind do what it wants to do. Ayush Anubhav, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. It says hi. I'll say hi back. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining. You've made it this far. The rabbit hole you are willing to go. Because whether or not you decide to go down or you want to stay on the surface of things really is of no consequence. But maybe there is a consequence to that. But what is never changes. So what is... Beautiful day to everyone. Thank you, Rustier. Ista says you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for participating. That was so fun. Thank you, Mallory. I appreciate it. I really enjoy having the comments. It gives me inspiration to talk, to do these live conversations versus feeling like I'm just talking to myself. But I am talking to myself because, we're all one. There is not two. So what is at the end of the rabbit hole? This, obviously, you knew that. So thank you. Until next time. ¿Dónde vamos uno? Vamos todos.